You are listening to the Move the Dirt podcast. The information provided in this podcast is for educational purposes only. It is not intended to provide medical, legal, or any other professional advice. You should always seek advice from an appropriately qualified and experienced professional.
Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in. Today I have the pleasure of being joined by Kelsey Buchalter from sunny South Africa. Kelsey has a very interesting story. I've been looking for someone to speak on this particular subject for some time. It's something which has affected a very dear family member of mine for possibly the majority of their lifetime, and I've been looking for someone to speak on this issue. I happened to stumble across Kelsey's work. I say stumble, but perhaps there was something which was pushing me towards her work. So hello, Kelsey. Thank you very much for joining us. It's lovely to see you today.
Thank you so much for having me, Bill. But I will correct you in that it's not really sunny South Africa because we're in winter, although it was technically sunny today, but it's cold.
Well, I'd imagine a bad weather day in South Africa is probably better than a good weather day in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, it was like 18 degrees Celsius today. But...
Okay, well, we're in the height of summer, and I think that you were probably warmer than it is here, and we've just had torrential rain all day today.
Yeah. Okay.
So as I say, thank you very much for joining us. I'm very excited to speak to you today. There is so much that I could talk to you about. I understand you have had a history of dealing with bulimia, anorexia, and also chronic anxiety. May I start by asking you to take us back in your life to when perhaps you remember first encountering, or maybe with hindsight you see the signs of when things started and when these difficulties emerged for you?
Honestly, have felt it since like my earliest childhood memories were of me just feeling anxious and shy and insecure. Like I didn't really know another reality. Until fast forward many years, I found the carnivore diet, but we're going to get into that. But yeah, my earliest childhood memories were just those of feeling anxious and scared and always worried. A lot of anxiety. I had major separation anxiety from my mom. So I really struggled to leave her, specifically for like preschool. So,
Right.
I mean, yeah, kind of basically from birth, essentially. And it's very interesting because with what I know now, and we'll definitely dive deep into this, but this is just to kind of summarize where I'm coming from. There's a difference between situational anxiety or depression, where there's like an overt big T, or even just overt trauma or some incident or many incidences that happen. None of us come out of this life unscathed. Of course, I've had traumas, but with me, it's like I've only ever known anxiety. And it's always felt that it was more physiological. And
Right.
again, in hindsight, that's kind of what I've come to learn, and why, what I stumbled upon and what has worked for me has actually worked so well. But it was from the get-go just a chronic state of anxiety and just fear and worry. And that, I was the perfect breeding ground for later on in life for anorexia, bulimia, eating disorders to just manifest. So it's a very brief overview of like taking you back. It kind of was always there. And I do have some hypotheses regarding this, if you want me to dive deep into that.
Oh, please. Yes.
So, I mean, of course, Allah Gabor Mate, like there is, definitely generational trauma that I just could have, just like been just by default due to my family history and generations prior me, which wasn't it was a very scary history for my family. My family were Jewish. And so, like my great grandfather fled Lithuania like at a very young age, and there was a lot of generations of trauma in that regard alone. So there is that. I was also born through C-section, and with all the latest research about the gut microbiome, my gut was already vulnerable and predisposed. Thank goodness my mom breastfed me, and I loved the boob so much I didn't stop breastfeeding until I was 3. So that saved me at least. But yeah, I mean, the research about gut inflammation, gut microbiome, leaky gut, IBS, of which I've had gut symptoms my whole life as well. I mean, that's another big cog in the wheel, for the likes of a better word, contributing factor to my anxiety. This gut-brain axis, of course, the gut is basically like the first brain. So if it's already predisposed and inflamed from the get-go, then of course, kind of perpetuates and progresses. And throw on antibiotic as a kid. I had lots of chronic throat infections, eventually needing to get my throat tonsils taken out at 9, modern life, I suppose. Although my family, we mostly ate at home and we cooked our own food, there were like vegetable oils and gluten and pasteurized dairy that were definitely triggering for me. So those are kind of like my hypotheses, in that I, from the get-go, was just, there was a lot of neural inflammation. There was a lot of gut inflammation, and that, in conjunction with life experience and trauma, for the likes of a better word, kind of just spiraled into just this chronic progression of inflammation that eventually turned into severe eating disorders.
So anxiety, Kelsey, could you explain perhaps to someone that's been fortunate enough to have never experienced real anxiety, how does anxiety make you feel, and how does it impact your life?
It's a good question. Of course, everyone has their own individual experience, but for me, it's just this like chronic sense of not feeling safe and secure in the world. Like, it's just, you're always worrying about something. You're always fearing something. I think the word not like safe, not like unsafety, just not feeling safe is probably like the best way to describe it for me. And it's scary not to feel safe. Even intellectually, even though you realize that on the outside, I have nothing to worry about. I've got loving parents. I'm close with my family. I've got 2 brothers. I've got 2 dogs. On the outside, there's nothing for me to be worrying about. But inside, it's just this, like, I just don't feel safe and secure in the world. And not, again, like through the lens of an eating disorder, like how scary and unsettling it is not to feel safe and secure in your own body. And I think that's what makes eating disorders really, really complicated. Eating disorders are often spoken through the lens of addiction because there are a lot of parallels. But like, unlike cigarettes or alcohol or other drugs, you can't just like throw away your body. So to feel unsettled, unsafe, and insecure in your own body really makes things complicated. And, for the most part, probably why anorexia has the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric illness, unfortunately.
Don't know perhaps whether you would have realised at the time, probably not, I would imagine, but looking back, how old were you when you developed the first sign of an eating disorder?
I was 3, probably, and I started ballet when I was like 2.5, 3 years old, and I just already then remember comparing myself and wanting to be small because I thought that the small girls were cute. And I wanted to be cute and I wanted people to like me. So already from there, you can already kind of see, and I'll get to like, it is a myth, but of course it's still a contributing factor, but like this distorted belief that thin will make me happy. So with the biological underpinning for the predisposition of anorexia and other eating disorders, like that was kind of like this spark that like ever since then, I just also remember just being fixated always. And again, going back to always feeling unsafe in the world, very much unsafe in my body if I wasn't small enough. So I also just remember always struggling with food in a way where I was always hungry and battling to feel satiated at the same time. At the time, I wasn't necessarily eating. I mean, although it was like, for the most part, a whole foods diet, but it was a mixed diet. There's a lot of carbohydrates, which of course, affect satiety signaling, etc. And of course, there was still junk food and chocolate and treats here and there, but that is enough to cause inflammation and lack of satiety signaling. But why I'm going down this rabbit hole is that for those who know of Dr. Andrew Huberman, he has a podcast, Huberman Podcast, and he's done a really, really great episode on eating disorders specifically. And why I really appreciate that episode is that it kind of validates the brain phenotype, for the likes of a better word, of the anorexic / eating disordered brain. He speaks about anorexia, bulimia, and like binge eating disorder. And how the brain is wired in those conditions makes sense why there is a sort of mismatch between the HPA axis and just satiety signaling in and of itself. So that I do encourage those who want to understand the neurobiology of an eating disorder, because it's not my main message today as well. And I'm jumping way into the future of this conversation, but my main message is that an eating disorder is not a character flaw. It's not like we wake up one day and ask for an eating disorder. Our brains have been wired a certain way. And back in the day, in our hunter-gatherer ancestral times, that was an advantage. Like the people who get anorexia or bulimia today would have thrived in famine, for example.
Yes.
So it's just kind of exacerbated today in this modern world. And of course, now in this modern world, with the invention of even just mirrors, and then of course advertising and social media, etc., which is why earlier I said that the whole vanity thing is kind of a myth for like the cause of anorexia, which of course it still contributes. It kind of just makes it, whereas if we were in the hunter-gatherer ancestral days, like we would just be surviving, it wouldn't necessarily be as pathological, I don't think, as it is now. But I think I hope I'm making sense in that regard.
You are. No, you are absolutely. And
Yeah.
I picked up on something you said earlier when you referenced that someone who suffers from chronic anxiety and that there is a direct link. I think you use words such as anxiety was like a breeding ground for future eating disorders. Could you explain the link between the two? Someone like myself that doesn't have an in-depth understanding, in some ways I can see that they might be linked, but I'm struggling to find an exact causal link. Is that something that you can help me with?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I can't prove causation because I don't have like a randomized control trial.
Sure.
But of course, again, like I'm a huge proponent of just continuing to repeat the fact that we are all unique and bio-individuality trumps all. So whereas inflammation in someone like manifests as PCOS or type 2 diabetes, like inflammation for me directly translates into anxiety and neural inflammation and mental health issues. So
Right.
that in and of itself, even someone could have anxiety, but maybe it manifests as like a drug addiction or OCD, for example. But in my specific context, me being a female, me starting again my life experience, ballet, very much being aware of my body. And again, as I said, like a female who's a sensitive soul because I'm also just anxious and everything is just heightened in my perception of reality in and of itself. It was just my whole life experience as well as my biological predisposition for it was the perfect breeding ground for eventually. So I can't say for everyone that there's a direct correlation always. Like if you have anxiety, because some people don't have necessarily anxiety and they still develop an eating disorder. But for me,
Yes.
in my like bio-individual context and life experience and just who I am, it was the perfect breeding ground for an eating disorder.
My understanding from studying your story for myself was that you developed bulimia first and that progressed into anorexia. Is that right?
Yes, I'd glorified being thin from like 3 years old. So I'd always tried to starve myself. I figured out how to make myself purge. And so even though all the while I was still like trying to go like kind of binge purge cycle, before I figured out how to purge, I was back and forth with like being in a chronic calorie deficit, but then feeling so hungry and then jumping into like quote unquote binging. And I never overtly looked anorexic. And that's another myth. You can still be anorexic and be quote normal or even overweight. I also say like once you have an eating disorder, you kind of have them all. So, or at least there's huge, susceptibility or predisposition to have them all. But I would say in terms of being diagnosed with an eating disorder, I was only really flagged when I began to purge, even though all the while, all throughout the years, I was always back and forth on like restricting, not restricting, restricting, not restricting. It's a horrible, crude thing to say, but like in the eating disorder space, they often say a bulimic is a failed anorexic. I mean, that's just terrible to say. But essentially, I hope that kind of answers your question with
It does
that,
indeed.
yeah.
And can you help us understand the eating disorders? How did they impact your life? Did they stop you doing things that you might otherwise have done, that you wanted to do, maybe even things that you loved, but you just, perhaps with a combination of the eating disorders and the anxiety, that was just too overwhelming for you at that point to combat those collectively? And, how did those things impact your life?
They like took my life away. And I'm not perfect. Like there are days where I really do struggle and there are periods where I struggle, but I think ultimately I've just got the resilience to kind of get through and get myself back on track. But I feel like also my the eating disorders were kind of controlled to a certain extent, throughout school, in that there was like a set structure in place with school, and like everyone was following the same routine and the same schedule. Maybe there were like different subjects here and there, but for the most part, I was like in a set, controlled environment. And the minute I left school is when things really hit the fan for me regarding my eating disorders. And it's then, the few years after school until 2018. So I ended school in 2014, and then I found carnivore at the end of 2018. And
So how old, Kelsey, how old are you when you leave school in South Africa? 18.
yeah, 18. Those were really bad, acute, like needing to be in hospital years, back and forth, back and forth. So I tried to study many things, and every time I started, I found myself in another clinic or a hospital. So, it took quite a few years off of my life. And to be honest, it has not been easy sailing. I'm still trying to figure this all out. I'm still,
Sure.
growing and evolving and learning. I'm just older now, hopefully a little bit more wise. But it still sometimes affects me to this day, in that, like, I have lost out on a lot of things. I've said no to so many opportunities. And again, it's not because it's a character flaw. It's not because I'm asking myself to do it, but the nature of it is that, like, you get stuck almost. It literally takes away every ounce of joy and every ounce of life that was in you. I mean, my mom often speaks about, in hindsight, like when I was my most sick, specifically the anorexia, like my eyes were just dead. Like they were literally, you could look at me and I was just like not there, if that makes sense.
Right.
And I have seen like photos of myself, and it's like, yeah, it's quite intense.
Mentally and emotionally, you're somewhere else.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
That's
Yeah.
something I've heard others who suffer with the same condition say to me.
Yeah, you're just like not yourself. If I were to write a book, it would be this, so no one steal the title, but it's kind of becomes this uncontrollable control. It's almost like a secondary person inside of your head. In like a lot of extensive therapy that I've done, like we would actually name it. So it can either be called, I like using the monkey mind now because I feel like it's a little bit lighter, but my first dietitian therapist had me label it the black wolf. Because it
Right.
is. It literally takes over you. And again, I'm jumping into some practical tips here, but there's an amazing addiction medicine specialist. Her name is Bitten Johnson from Sweden. I've interviewed her on my podcast, and she's also been my lecturer, fortunately for me, when I did my nutrition training. And she speaks about the blue dog and the red dog. So the red
Right.
dog is kind of like the eating disorder, the black wolf, right? And the blue dog is your actual, like, genuine, authentic self. Like you with life, your love, your passion, your morals, your values, just like you alive. And the dog that is most active is the one that you feed.
Right.
A big part of my recovery journey, not only about biological repair through something like a carnivore diet, for example, but was also this like passion and purpose piece. That is so huge because, like, basically the opposite of addiction is passion and purpose and meaning. So that's a very big part of the recovery piece for all my clients that I work with, for myself as well. Because if you're not actively nourishing your blue dog, then your red dog is alive and it's loud and it will continue. I mean, for anorexia specifically, you're either going to continue to live in misery and kind of get by, or you're going to die, or you're going to choose to live.
You said something there which resonated with me. You said, I believe the red dog, it can be loud. And I remember coming across a book, and for the life of me in this moment, I can't remember the name of it, unfortunately. If I remember, I'll put it in the description. But the lady who wrote it also suffered with anorexia, and she referred to that condition by the name of Ed. And the book might be called something like Ed and Me. And she refers to this voice in her head. Separate from something like schizophrenia, this voice is really tapping into what I recall was her self-worth. And she would look at something and this voice called Ed would be saying to her, you don't deserve that chocolate cake, you don't deserve this, you don't deserve that. Is that something that you can resonate with from your own experience?
Totally. To kind of view it through the same lens as like OCD, it's kind of like those compulsions. So you've built up these like distorted beliefs that you cling onto, and you think like if you don't do them or if you don't do XYZ, then this is going to happen. Again, feeding that very unsafe nervous system. And again, like for anorexia specifically, what I've seen is that you need to feel safe and secure. Your nervous system needs to feel safe, because when you're safe, and another word of saying this is when you're in a parasympathetic state, when you're calm, your prefrontal cortex comes online. And then you're actually, when you're calm, most of the time, you want to look after yourself. So
Right.
that part of actively choosing to make yourself calm and do the things you love, which at the end of the day, how fun is that? Like all you have to do is be calm and do the things you love. And it's interesting with eating disorders, specifically anorexia, because it's kind of like the reward systems are distorted and it's kind of backwards in a way. Another way that I can speak about anorexia specifically, well, I suppose any eating disorder and any self-harm type of behavior, but it is kind of an autoimmune condition. It's like your own self attacking itself.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, just as a
That makes
metaphor
sense
to
to
kind
me.
of play with. Yeah, it's a little bit backwards. And again, going back to that Huberman podcast, he really explains it so well. It's part of the wiring of the brain in an anorexic.
What age were you when you were officially diagnosed as having an eating disorder, and what led to the diagnosis? Was, for example, did your family realize that there was an issue, or was it something that you realized yourself?
I'll backtrack in that the first psychologist I went to, I think I was 8 or 9, and she had diagnosed me with generalized anxiety disorder. When I started to purge, that's when I'd always seen the same psychologist since I was 8 or 9. And fortunately, I'm a total open book and like I can't lie. However, when I was actively anorexic, that was like the time in my life where I was very deceitful. But I was always open about it to my dad. I wanted to hide it from my mom because I wanted to protect my mom. When my psychologist at the time heard that I was bulimic, she obviously diagnosed me bulimic first, and then she sent me to a dietitian who specialized in eating disorders, actually. She was really cool compared to the conventional dietitian in that her practice was all about mindfulness and conscious eating, and that was really good for me. And it was actually a really safe place. Like, I am really grateful, not necessarily about her dietary advice for the most part, but her ethos and how she practiced was beautiful and really, really safe. So that was good. But yeah,
Okay.
when I was diagnosed with the bulimia, I was like 15, 16.
I'm sure you've had conversations with your family. How do you believe historically that your condition affected your family? I'm sure they were incredibly worried about you.
Yeah. It still has left really large marks in our family. As I said, I was always really, really close with my dad. In one stint, like, my dad dropped everything and read as much as he could. I mean, he was always very aware. My dad is an optometrist, so he was always very aware of like, biology and mental health. And he was also naturally, due to his mom was a theater nurse. They were both very against like just jumping to pharmaceutical drugs, because I think my late gran just saw some of the harsh realities of even just side effects of drugs, pharmaceutical drugs is what I mean, not necessarily, but drugs as well. My dad was always averse to medication. And in fact, when I was 16, around about the time or just after I was diagnosed with bulimia, I was actually put on antidepressants by a psychiatrist, because at that time, interestingly, I had a major flare up of my separation anxiety, which I had had from like a very, very, very young kid. So that was bizarre. That's when I started taking antidepressants. We can go into that tangent of a rabbit hole about antidepressants. But going back to your question, sorry, what was your question? Taking myself a
So
minute.
really the effect that its condition had on the family.
Yeah. So my dad, at one point, I was actually reinstated into a government hospital because of my devastatingly low weight. I will refrain from saying numbers unless you want me to. I don't mind, but it may be trick. I don't know. You can let me know if you want numbers.
Only if you're comfortable with doing that.
Yeah. For those who understand kilograms, I was 24 kilograms at that point.
And how old would you have been, Kelsey, at
I
that
was
stage?
20 something.
Right.
20, 21, 22.
So sort of
Possibly.
early 20s, and
Yeah,
you're
early 20s.
20,
I'm 29 now.
29 now. Okay.
Yeah. So I was a real threat to my own life, obviously. So they reinstated me then and there in this government hospital, and it was like literally behind bars because it was like their main psychiatric ward. And it was like really scary because my parents and I just thought that I was going for a psychiatric assessment. This was like I'd already been to 2 clinics and relapsed bad, but they reinstated me then and there, and I was admitted involuntarily for 7 months, never knowing when I would be discharged. But what I wanted to say is that my dad literally every single visiting hour, he would be there. Like every single day for 7 months, he came to visit me and I would just be there like crying. My mom was basically my best friend throughout school. However, when I was acutely sick with anorexia, for some reason, I just couldn't be with her. She couldn't be with me. I think her love came out in anger, unfortunately. And it wasn't even her natural, like that came because when I was put in my first clinic, which was probably the most traumatizing of them all, it was an eating disorder specific clinic. I left more traumatized than when I came in. I thought I was going to hopefully find some healing. I don't know how that place still exists. It was just horrendous. And they had painted this awful picture of me to my mom. And so my mom kind of like through those dietitians and I don't know if you can call them psychologists or whatever they really painted a bad picture to my mom, like via email saying, don't ever believe anything that Kelsey says. She's just lying. She's manipulating you, etc., etc. Which I understand where they're coming from because addiction and eating disorders, you lie. I mean, I was deceitful. So I'm not invalidating that, but how it affected my mom and my relationship was almost unfair. And to be honest, like it's definitely repaired, but I don't know if those scars could ever go away.
I understand.
So unfortunately, like our relationship became, I hate using this word, but toxic, literally toxic. I couldn't be in the same room as her. Like eating was hard enough already and fearful for me. And like it would always, like she would just happen to say or be there at the wrong time. And kind of she took on this like policewoman. But I mean, of course, I can't blame her because I'm her daughter. Like any mother with their motherly instincts wants their child to eat. So I do understand both sides. But
it's
for
almost
many
desperation, I would imagine.
Literally.
She's so desperate for you to be well.
Yeah, 100%. And I don't blame her for it. I feel like if it were my daughter, I would act the same. But it just was not. Yeah, it was really bad. Our relationship strained, and it was just so wild to me that our relationship was like that because like all I'd known was her being my best friend. Yeah, so that was just my parents, and then of course my brothers took strain. So I have an older and a younger brother. I almost like it's not fair what they've witnessed. I don't think anyone should have ever witnessed that, and I of course apologize for everything that they've witnessed as well. But I don't want to. Also, I mean, again, like it's not necessarily that I asked for this either, but yeah, it has a part of family. It really does.
Okay.
It is a family system. You know,
the good news
whole
for you is
family has to heal.
you had the courage to find the way out.
Yeah.
So before I get into how you had the courage to come out of this position, something that I was very interested in a moment ago that you mentioned, and you said you were happy to delve a little deeper, was the situation with antidepressants. Because something which immediately came to mind when speaking to you and you mentioned antidepressants is I have been around people that take antidepressants, and my experience of communicating with them is that possibly it's only relevant to certain types of antidepressants, but they can seem very distant. Now, you have already shared with us that you at times have already felt very distant, and that almost, I think, forgive me if you didn't use this exact terminology, but there was almost a vacancy in your eyes. So you being prescribed antidepressants, did that help or hinder you, do you think?
It 1000% hindered me, and I will say is actually quite an important point is that I was on an array of antidepressants before I became like a medical crisis with anorexia. So I was actively bulimic whilst being on antidepressants as well. And why I say this is that one of the major side effects for me with the antidepressants was extreme weight gain very quickly. And for anyone with or without an eating disorder, that is unsettling and scary. So put that in me already, as I've kind of laid out my context of who I am as a person, can understand why from like those antidepressants, I became even more determined to become thin. So I'm of course not blaming them, but just that one side effect alone, and I was on a few for a few years. Another huge side effect for me was like if I forgot to take an antidepressant, I would lose all ability to like walk and have any like hand-eye coordination. Like I remember I was on tour and we were going on a hike up a mountain, and that day I'd forgotten to take my antidepressant and I nearly fell off the mountain because I wasn't able to walk properly.
Right. And
But
was this psychological or physical as well, do
no,
you
this
think?
was physical. This was
So it was
100%
physical.
physical. Yeah.
Right.
It wasn't psychological, but to be honest, psychological is physical. It's one and the same thing. But yeah, no, they were horrific, and the withdrawal symptoms were even worse. Especially after like gaining a lot of weight on my last antidepressant that I was on. It was actually in a clinic, and the psychiatrist at the time that I was seeing wanted to change my medications, and she changed me in the clinic, and I literally gained 15 kilograms in 3 weeks. And that tipped me over the edge. That tipped
Yes.
me over the absolute edge. And from that moment, I decided I'm weaning myself off of medication. Obviously, you cannot do this without medical supervision. Please do not learn from my mistakes. Don't even try. But yeah, I weaned myself off of these medications, and it was
So
horrific.
you decided to take yourself
Yeah.
off
I
of
told her,
antidepressants
I
with the
told her,
doctor's
yeah.
cooperation.
I told her she wasn't wanting me to. She wanted me to stay. So she kind of like said, okay, well, you can do it this way. And I did it. And I was so ill, specifically nausea. I was in bed for like 10 days. I had to take the anti-nausea medication that they give chemo patients because the nausea was so severe and nothing was working.
Wow.
I was like gone. I was like a vegetable, basically. I wasn't able to move or anything. And from that day, I was just kind of like switched my Black Wolf on loud, and
Right.
nothing
Yeah.
was, it's only now in the last few years slowly quietening down. You know what I mean? Like with all the things that I've come to learn that are actually helpful. So yeah, that was really intense. And yeah, I'm not against pharmaceuticals. Thank goodness for modern medicine, specifically in an emergency case. And I'm not refuting that antidepressants are life-saving for a lot of people. But I do want to speak out about and normalize
They
the fact
didn't
that,
help
like,
you.
they did not help me, and they haven't helped a lot of people. And the withdrawal symptoms, and I mean, I'm not sure if your audience are familiar with Dr. Chris Palmer, but like, he's a really, really good resource as well.
Okay, fantastic. So I believe this is you're in hospital around 2014, you said?
No, so I've been in a few. I was one in 2015, and 2017 I was also again, no, 2016, 2017, and the last one was February 2018.
Okay. And so something I'm fascinated by is you're dealing with the eating disorder. You've acknowledged you've got chronic anxiety, which in my experience of my social relationships with people that I have around me, and I've spoken to other guests on the podcast to say that in my experience and in my circles, I have never seen so many people suffering with anxiety as I'm seeing at the moment. And some people that have never been affected suddenly are telling me that it's an effort just to leave their house. So I think we're in very difficult times, but you're dealing with all of this, and lots of people who suffer with anxiety tell me that all they're craving constantly is structure and routine. Anything that deviates from a routine of, getting up at this time, having breakfast at this time, I go to the gym at this time, I go to the library at this time. They're saying anything that deviates from that is crippling to them. So how do you deal with all of that and then you start to come out the other side? What do you think was the starting point for your recovery?
Sorry, that was a really good point, and I just want to highlight that need, and I speak to myself as well. I am one of those people, like, routine, because it's just what is shouting to me is like we all just want some certainty in these uncertain
Sure.
times. Again, it was difficult. It's really, really difficult, especially with anorexia. At the end of the day, you have to want recovery. Like, no one can force that upon yourself. It has to come from within. But in order to get there, I truly believe that firstly, you need to biologically stabilize. So eating an anti-inflammatory diet would really be helpful for, again, the brain to just start functioning happily again. But yeah, I mean, let me take myself back.
Kelsey,
Yeah.
sorry, forgive me. May I just interrupt you there, because you've mentioned inflammation a lot, and I'm getting the feeling that you believe that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I am getting the feeling that you're connecting inflammation directly with the eating disorder or anxiety, or possibly both. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes, you are both. And the inflammation can come from like literal, like biological components, so like pieces of food or getting exposed to some toxin or whatever. But it can also come from like mental stresses, lack of sleep, poor quality occupational health, like a fight with or in a bad relationship with someone, or an like not necessarily even speaking your truth. Those all cause stress and inflammation in the body. So it can
Right.
come from many areas. But yeah, like that's why I say any symptom that you have, it's like a sign from your body. Like there's always a root cause for it. It doesn't just like happen out of anywhere. So yeah, to be a detective on yourself and try to like seek, okay, why am I feeling anxious? Continue to like find the root cause. Why?
Right.
It can really be helpful for people.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so you're starting to turn the corner. You're facing all of these issues, but you find it within yourself to start this road to recovery. So how does it start for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. And even after my last admission into a clinic, I still didn't really want recovery. It was over time. It's a long process. Well, for me it was quite long, still sometimes going, because there are days where I have to fight really hard. Now I need to think about this because one huge piece of the puzzle is that after my last discharge, this was like beginning middle of 2018. I was in the clinic for the last time in February 2018. But after that, I had like really white knuckled life. I just was adamant never to be admitted. They actually said to me at the clinic that the bed at the government hospital that I was at before was waiting for me, which terrified me. I did not want to go back. So that kind of was like enough to just be like, I'm just going to get by, but I really don't want to do this. And I'm angry and I don't want to let go, quote unquote, of the eating disorder. But I reached a point in my recovery where I was at a weight stable enough to be able to start exercising again. And I loved exercising from a genuine place, not only from like an eating disorder place. But
Sure.
I thought that finding an adult dance class would be really conducive to my recovery and my healing because I'd always loved dancing and singing and acting and all the things. So long story short, I reached out to someone via a friend of mine who was in musical theater, and he gave me this guy's number, and I sent him a message saying, hey, do you perhaps know of any adult dance classes in Cape Town? And he says, I'm actually opening up a new musical theater academy next year. Would you like to audition? And I'm like, what? Firstly, I was like out of it. I was in a dire state. Like I was only barely surviving. And I somehow had a mature thought in being like, what do I actually have to lose? So I said, yeah. And that was a Tuesday. He said, cool, auditions are this weekend. Send me your email address and we'll provide you with all the details. I had like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday to prepare 2 songs and 2 monologues. Now, luckily,
Wow.
everyone knew me in primary school for like singing and music and acting, etc. So fortunately, that was always in the back, and a huge part of my blue dog, actually. So that was like a huge, and why I'm also very outspoken about the purpose and passion piece. Just for those few days, I didn't even care. I wasn't even expecting to get in because, I mean, the audition, like I was surrounded by really talented people, like this person doing splits, etc. But anyway, I got through the audition and there was quite an extensive interview. And of course, they knew a little bit of, and they could see like my background. And so that was part of the conversation. Did not expect to get in. I ended up getting accepted and I
Fantastic.
graduated. I finished it. I finished the one thing that I started. I graduated in 2022 and that was like every day since getting accepted was a huge piece of pulling me back to myself, really, and getting
Right.
my prefrontal cortex back online because it was kind of like therapy for me. It was my playtime from a young girl. Those were things that I always loved doing. And so I'm also a huge proponent that creativity is 1000% a tenet of health for us all, no matter what that
Right.
looks like for each and every one of us. But that was a big part. Now, soon after I'd even done my audition, my ex-boyfriend, my boyfriend at the time, he had a friend whose mom was a health coach slash nutritionist. And given my dad being an optometrist, he worked with a lot of diabetic patients. And so I'm sure you're familiar with Professor Tim Noakes.
I am indeed, yes.
Yeah, he popularized basically the ketogenic, although in South Africa we call it Banting diet, low carb, high fat in South Africa. I think when I was already in high school, and I'd always kind of been familiar and similar to you when you were speaking about your low carb journey, it always just made sense to me. Just, low carb, high fat. And naturally, I loved fatty meat. I never had a sweet tooth. So anyway, I went to my ex's friend's mom for a consultation. And it was like a 3-hour consultation. And she just said to me, Kelsey, for the next 10 days, you're going to be eating beef and eggs. And just something switched. I don't know if it was my primal instinct, but just something switched inside of me that just made so much sense. And I was, for the first time, excited. I went home to my ex-boyfriend's house and I got boiled eggs. And that was near the end, like I think October 2018. Never looked back since.
So I find that amazing, Kelsey, that you're told that you're going to eat beef and eggs for the next 10 days.
Yeah.
And you seem enthused by that. This is great. And yet in my mind, I'm thinking that someone who has suffered from an eating disorder, that would be their idea of a nightmare.
Yeah.
Why do you think you didn't feel that way?
A few things. And there's one very big thing in that I naturally loved fatty meat. I was kind of following keto-ish before that, but there's like a green, an orange, and a red list.
Yes.
And like to try and pick out like it was almost the paradox of choice when it was such a long list of like different green leafy vegetables, and I would just get too overwhelmed with the choice. I think it just liberated me from decision fatigue, essentially. Although I would say that there's so much in the rainbow of meats that it is sometimes hard to choose which meat you want. But those are two big things. But also I was very aware, again, understanding low carb, high fat and what blood glucose does to the brain. I don't know, somehow I just think it was just in conversations with my dad over the years and understanding diabetes, for example, that carbohydrates first never did well with me and my stomach. As I said earlier, I had a lifetime of severe gut issues and gut inflammation and IBS, and like high carbohydrate foods were not only terrible for my mental mood, I would always have these like massive highs and then these absolute crashes, and those highs and lows were quite literally mental highs and lows for me. So I never did well with carbohydrates either, and so to kind of been like gotten permission to just stick with fat and meat was like a liberating thing for me. Yeah.
You said that the low carb stance made sense to you. Why did that? Why did it make sense? Because I think if you speak to most people about nutrition, despite the guests that I've been lucky enough to have on, who have all, without exception, said to me, there is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. I believe in South Africa you have similar thing. They call it the happy plate, or you've got your food pyramid. And I think Tim Noakes has been instrumental in showing that clearly isn't the way that humans should be eating.
Yeah.
But I think for most people that haven't looked into that, if you tell them that they're not supposed to be, or there is no necessity for them to eat carbohydrates, it's almost too much for them to comprehend, because they're used to this pyramid where they tell us to eat more grains, and predominantly they're telling you for your diet to be dominated by carbohydrates. So my question to you would be, why did low carb make sense to you?
Well, I think maybe it's because I'm a primal. I just think firstly, it's all the foods that I love. So there's that. But secondly, at the time, I didn't know that there was no essential need for a carbohydrate. That was only like later on, after I graduated musical theater, really, when I studied nutrition, that I learned that. But I just think the fact that a true low carb, high fat diet is one that espouses real whole foods. No processed foods. And so that made sense to me in one way or another. I just think, also with like, again, going back to my dad and his patients, like when someone's sick, again, going back to inflammation, like an anti-inflammatory diet makes sense as well. And then obviously in hindsight, a low carbohydrate diet for the most part mimics our species appropriate diet, the diet that we evolved on as a human species throughout time. Of course, different regions in the world have seasonal different foods available at different times of the year. So, places closer to the equator will have more fruit than Finland, for example. But yeah, it just
felt right.
It just felt right. And it was more so at that time, honestly, this like primitive instinct. It just was like, oh, this makes sense. But I think the biggest thing for me was that I actually, because some people think that, like, firstly, in the beginning, I was met with a lot of like backlash, especially from my parents. They were like, this is another eating disorder. And people think that it's like so restrictive, but I feel so liberated. I feel the opposite of restricted because restricted to me was before carnivore, where I didn't even have, I mean, I told you earlier that like you may have to tell me to stop talking, and I would like
No,
rather have
please
a
talk
brain.
away.
My brain came back on, and like even more than when I'd ever experienced it before. But like before carnivore, I was just like dead. I had I wasn't even able to formulate sentences. Like that's restrictive. Living in complete terror and fear, that's restrictive. So I feel so free and liberated, even though overtly it looks like it's restrictive, but to me I feel the freest I've ever been.
So you done your 10 days on the beef and eggs. And
Yeah.
was it literally just beef and eggs?
Yeah. It
No,
was
no
she
veg at that point.
no, 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 no,
No.
no.
Okay.
No.
So it's a bit like almost like a Ken Berry
Yeah,
type diet.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. So you do your 10 days. How are you feeling at the end of the 10 days and where do you go from there?
Well, I've never stopped. So it was amazing. It was like it was almost like the floodgates opened again. I felt like whenever I go to like a butchery, I felt like a kid in a candy store. I'd never really known all the ins and outs of different cuts of meat, etc. So learning all of that, trying new things, and I get excited for every single meal.
That's amazing. So did you have any period of time on a sort of ketogenic diet, including low carb veg, or did you go straight from the beef and the eggs straight into full-fledged carnivore?
Well, I mean, the beef and the eggs were basically carnivore, but before that, I was kind of just like essentially low carb, but like no fat because I was fearful of fat.
Right.
So I was basically just like cucumber and bok choy and then like lean protein. Like I wouldn't even allow myself like lamb, for example. It was
Yes.
basically just like chicken and eggs and some like dairy. So yeah, I kind of went straight into carnivore and it was just amazing. I mean, my body obviously and still does love and need fat.
So was your diet before you went on to this specific recommendation of the beef and the eggs? I'm assuming your diet would have been very different. Would that be a fair assumption?
Yeah, it was like lean protein and like just
Right. So like you just mentioned, you're eating
bread.
sort of lean chicken.
Yeah.
And are you eating grains and things like
No,
breads
no, no,
and
no, no.
things like that?
To
No.
be honest though, when I went to the first dietitian when I was first diagnosed with bulimia, she also, I mean, as I said, I've had like IBS my whole life, and she actually put me off of gluten, and
Right.
that really helped me a lot. So I was gluten free. I've been gluten free since I was like 15, 16. And then it was kind of like a slower transition into just, okay, protein and veg eventually.
So you go carnivore. How long have you been carnivore for now?
7 years.
7 years. And
Yeah.
you're still loving your meals, as you just said. You look forward to each one.
Yes, yes, I honestly, yeah, it's amazing.
And you're now qualified or certified to give other people nutrition advice.
Yes.
You're certified by the Nutrition Network, which is an organization, I believe, run by Tim Noakes as well.
Yes. Yes.
What sort of types of people come to you for advice? Are you specializing in helping people that have had eating disorders, or are you helping people generally with nutrition? I'm excited to see what you're doing now to help others. Now you've helped yourself.
Yeah, it's all of the above. I mean, obviously my heart, like I want to just change the whole paradigm specifically with eating disorder treatment. But I would I mean, a human is a human, and again, like everything that I know and in hindsight, like just, I just use the framework of getting to the root of whatever is causing you inflammation. And I truly believe that eating a species appropriate diet, I'm not dogmatic in any way. I would never tell someone that they can't eat, like a sweet potato, for example. I'm not like that at all. But there's context and nuance and bio individuality, which is why I love working with people because that definitely gets missed online, especially. But yeah, I work with anyone and everyone because I believe that, firstly, it's our birthright to live in optimal health and well being. And I've learned so much by some of the world's leading experts, Prof. Tim Noakes himself, for example, and in an array of different things. I've also done a peer recovery training, like for addiction. But yeah, I work with
Fantastic.
an array of people.
Listening to your own podcast and the episodes you did on, I believe you titled them what my anorexia needed to know. So I've listened to those with great interest. I will put links to your podcast in the description, but anyone that's enjoyed today's conversation, definitely do go and listen to those podcasts. Something that was very interesting in the podcast was your reference to learning how to feed your brain with the correct nutrients and how that had an impact on how you felt and how that aided your recovery. Is there any information you could share for the listeners, Kelsey, on that specific subject, why you believe that changing your diet had such a radical effect on your mental health because you were adequately nourishing your brain?
Yeah. Well, I mean, specifically for the brain is like minus water, mostly just fat. So healthy fats are essential for the brain. So of course, a carnivore diet is really high in healthy fats, butter, egg yolks, fatty fish, etc., lamb, delicious, making myself hungry. But of course, we also need amino acids for the brain, for our neurotransmitters, for our hormones. So that was also a big part. And of course, you're eating a lot of protein. And then the big piece that I was speaking about earlier, and this is why a carnivore diet / even a ketogenic diet works so well, is that you finally begin to feel satiated. And that was a big struggle of mine throughout my whole life, as I mentioned earlier. So to feel satiated is also just calming. And I think when your body specifically is in a ketogenic state, the brain prefers that. In fact, most of our organs prefer ketones for fuel than sugar. So a lot of people speak about the keto clarity. So the high fat, when I'm running, I suppose I can only speak for myself, but when one is running off of ketones and fat for fuel, there's just a stability in the mood and
Right.
therefore the mind. Now, going back to the gut-brain axis, I also think a big reason why carnivore has worked so well for me is that it's also healed my gut, because I'm no longer insulting it with inflammatory foods. So there's actually been time and space for my gut to also heal. And of course, there's a bi-directional relationship between the gut and the brain. So in general, I'm going to go back to my word. It's just the simplest way of describing it to people, but like a ketogenic, and in my case, a ketogenic carnivore diet, so a high-fat carnivore diet, was very anti-inflammatory for me from a gut perspective, from a neurological perspective, in so many other perspectives. And that's honestly why I think that biologically it's helped so much. Another great resource is Dr. Daniel Amen, and he has this amazing hardware-software analogy in that if you liken the human body to the hardware of a computer and the psychology of a human to the software of a computer, how can you expect the software to function optimally if the hardware is beaten and battered? And so that
Right.
kind of
Yeah.
is what inspired me to start speaking about reverse engineering my mental health, because I did have to biologically stabilize first. And that's, I think, a big missing piece in the mental health paradigm period. Especially, like with anorexia, when you're going, or anyone, when you're admitted into a psychiatric ward, you're in a really bad space, both biologically and mentally. Like nutrients are essential in that state. I do call it reverse engineering my mental health.
Sure. And how long? I mean, I appreciate it will be very different for every person, but do you remember how long it took before you started to notice the signs yourself for starting to feel better?
It was my first meal.
Your first, right. Okay.
Yeah, my brain, I mean, also, the huge elephant in the room here is that I was so malnourished anyway. So I feel like any nutrients, but specifically protein and fat, I'm not sure if you're on the pulse with like abreast with some of the latest research. Not that I'm a huge advocate of potions and powders, but creatine has been shown now recently to be so effective in depression alone,
Yes.
especially paired with exercise. So, I mean, meat, there's creatine in meat. All the other amino acids like carnitine, all the things, you find that in the most bioavailable form in animal foods.
So, Kelsey, before I ask you to tell us where people can find you, if they're interested in your work, may I just ask if a listener out there is listening to this podcast and they're struggling with anxiety, they're struggling with an eating disorder of some type, what would your advice be to them? How do they go about taking those first few steps to recovery?
First, I want to say, if you want to put a hand on your heart and both hands on your heart, so just like take a breath. Just take a breath, because I firstly want to say that you are not broken, and this is not a character flaw. You're not missing something in your brain, for example. You're not broken. It's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And I think some actionable tools like that I would encourage someone to start thinking about is, what are your biggest dreams in life? Like, what are some of your aspirations? If it's just one, if it's maybe, I encourage you to just write it down. For example, for me, I want to be able to have children one day. I used to have the longest hair, for example, and yes, this could be a vanity thing, but I lost it all when I was really sick, and I really want to try grow it back again. That's a big
Right.
enough why. Again, all of these things that are hopefully connecting you to your blue dog to be able to start nourishing it, but write it down. Write it down and stick it somewhere that you can keep going back to remind yourself of. And also, like, ask yourself questions like, who could you be? Kind of like do a thought experiment. Who could I be? And then another powerful question that I often use is, if your symptoms could talk to you, what would they be saying? And this goes to both like emotional symptoms and also physical symptoms. Again, the basic premise is that we want to get the nervous system to feel safe again. And so whatever it takes, all the things that bring you joy and make you feel safe, I want you to commit to that. I want you to commit to spending and surrounding yourself with people and situations, and including the content that you consume. Have those be things that uplift you.
Right.
Yeah, I'll just leave this off with one powerful quote that in the midst of my anorexia, I went to a life coach, and I have spoken about this quote often, but it's just so profound. He said to me, Kelsey, if you're unable to nourish your authenticity, how do you expect to nourish yourself on a purely physiological level? I'll
Right.
repeat it. If you're unable to nourish your authenticity, how do you expect to nourish yourself on a purely physiological level? Again, going
Wow.
back to that
Yeah.
beautiful dance between nourishing your authenticity, your passion, your purpose, your meaning, you, versus nourishing yourself and your cells quite literally with food, how you move, how you sleep, relationships, light. I'm wearing my blue blockers, etc. Yeah. Hopefully
Excellent.
that helps.
No, absolutely. And something you've said there, Kelsey, I'd just like to ask you one more question, if I may.
Of course.
For the people that are listening to this podcast who are perhaps fortunate enough themselves not to be affected by an eating disorder or chronic anxiety, but have a close friend or a close relative who is, what can those people do to support that person that they love?
I think the first thing, again, going back to like reminding them as well that this is not a character flaw. No one just woke up one day and asked for this. And I think to be able to begin to see that the overt behaviors, even though they are dysfunctional and harmful, underneath that is the sad, hurt, scared, fearful, insert whatever word, person, a human with a very small blue dog that's being completely overridden by a very loud red dog. I think show them the love and support, even just by giving them a hug. To be honest, I kind of want to say, especially because in the early stages of recovery, when you're in a really, really bad space, you're really fragile. So like for me, the word healthy, I could not hear that word. It would be too triggering for me to even hear the word healthy, because that meant one thing and one thing only, like getting fatter. So language is so, so powerful. I wouldn't even bring up in these acute stages, if you really love someone, treat them as if you were showing love to a baby that's just fallen. Like, you won't shout at the baby for falling and hurting itself, right? You would pick up the baby and you would nurture it.
Sure.
And again, like, just trying everything you can. And I know it's easier said than done, but like, love them, because that will help calm them down. And hopefully, again, because you can't, and this is another piece of advice, you have to relinquish the fact that you can control. Recovery has to come from within, and it's not your responsibility. All you really can do is control your own self. And so just continually, like, consistently reminding them that you're there and you love them, and you, like, even if it's just a hug, they may not want to speak with you or whatever, but I think just doing whatever you can. I think seeing it through the eyes of, this is a baby that's fallen, I need to look after this baby, and of course there are times when maybe you do need to suggest like speaking to someone. I suppose it is also it's very hard for me to give generic advice, because of course
Sure.
every context is different, because sometimes maybe distance is needed. So I don't want to be very nuanced, but I'll just try keep very generic. But I think the biggest thing is just to see beneath the behaviors. What would you do to nurture that clearly struggling baby inside?
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with us. And Kelsey, just to finish off, if people have enjoyed this conversation and they would like to know more, I think I certainly would if I was listening. How do they find you? How can they find out more about your work?
Sure. So my podcast, which is called the Human Theatre Podcast, you can find that on Apple and Spotify. You can find me, I'm mostly active on Instagram and it's just my name at Kelsey Buchalter. I am also on LinkedIn. And if you want to reach out, my email address is kelseybuchalter@gmail.com. All lowercase.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I'll put links to those contact details in the description to the podcast. Kelsey, I cannot thank you enough. It's been absolutely fascinating listening to you. As I said at the beginning, this is something that's affected someone who I love more than I can say. And all I want for them is recovery and to live the life that I know they're capable of living. You've given me so much to work with. I can't wait to get this podcast out to people. In the UK, we've got record rates of eating disorders. And unfortunately, you have very little places to go. So I'm hoping that listening to this will be a starting point. And I know that you do help people as well from your nutrition coaching standpoint. So people will at least know there's someone that knows, that understands, that they can go to. As I say, I can't thank you enough. It's been amazing speaking with you.
Thank you.
I hope that we can stay in touch.
Definitely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bill.
Pleasure. Thanks very much. Do take care, Kelsey.
Too.
Bye for now.